I've always loved listening to scary stories, although I never thought I'd end up starring in one. My boyfriend and I are big fans of Mr. Horror. Every night after dinner, we settle on the couch, turn off the lights, and let his tales envelop us. There's something about those stories that captivates us as if they're the perfect way to feel fear from a safe distance. But what I'm about to tell you is neither safe nor distant. It's my own story, and it's something I never thought I'd experience firsthand. It all began when I was 16. I met a guy at school, and as often happens at that age, I fell madly in love. He was older than me, a couple of years older, and seemed to know exactly how to make me feel special. At first, everything was perfect. We went everywhere together, called each other at night, and talked about anything until we fell asleep. It was that youthful love that seems like everything. But as time went on, I began to notice that something wasn't right. At first, it was just comments that made me uncomfortable. He'd say things like, "You shouldn't go out with your friends so much," or "That outfit isn't appropriate for you." Little by little, his words became harsher, and whenever I tried to push back, he would explode in anger. He blamed me for everything, and I, confused and in love, thought it was normal, that he just cared about me. Until one day I realized I no longer had anyone else. I had distanced myself from my friends, my family, everything that made me feel safe. I tried to break up with him several times, but he always came back. He would find me, promise to change, cry outside my house, and I, with a soft heart and shattered self-esteem, would give him another chance. Each time I let him come back, it got worse. Jealousy became constant, the fights were nearly daily, and the insults that came out of his mouth were so hurtful that I convinced myself I might deserve them. But after 3 years, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I ended it for good, and although I was afraid of what he might do, I held on to the hope that he would eventually leave me alone. I couldn't have been more wrong. After that breakup, I promised myself I'd get my life back. I joined a gym to try to let go of the stress, meet new people, and feel good about myself again. That's where I met a new guy. He was the complete opposite of my ex. Calm, respectful, always made me laugh, and never made me feel like I had to justify myself for anything. We started talking after each workout, and soon it became something more. We began dating, and for the first time in a long time, I felt happy, without fear of being myself. But it didn't take long for my ex to find out I was with someone else. That's when his harassment became unbearable. He didn't just call me and send aggressive messages. He started showing up at my house, at my work, and worst of all, outside the gym. It was like he was everywhere. One day, while I was training, I saw him standing at the entrance of the gym, watching me like a predator stalking its prey. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore him. I gritted my teeth, pretended not to see him, but I knew it wouldn't be that easy. That night, as I was heading home, I felt something was off. I kept looking around, my heart racing, and though I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I quickened my pace, and just as I was about to reach my building, I heard fast footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there he was, staring at me with a mix of hatred and desperation. He started yelling at me, insulting me, and before I could react, he shoved me against the wall. I froze, not knowing what to do. His hands gripped my shoulders so tightly that it felt like they were splitting me in two. I managed to break free and ran toward the building door, slamming it shut just in time. My body was trembling so much I could barely get the keys out of my bag. From that day on, everything became a living hell. Every time I left the house, I had to look around. Every time my phone rang, my hands shook. He wouldn't stop stalking me. I reported him several times, but nothing seemed to work. The police said they needed more solid evidence, that his threats through messages weren't enough to arrest him. I felt trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. One afternoon, after a long gym session, I went outside to get some fresh air. I was exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. I walked toward the parking lot and saw him again, standing next to my car as if he had been waiting for me. This time, his face didn't show rage. There was something else, something I hadn't seen before that terrified me even more. A calm, unsettling look, as if he had already made a decision. Without saying a word, he lunged at me. He threw me to the ground and started beating me with a violence I had never experienced. Each punch was stronger than the last, and each one was accompanied by an insult, by a threat. He screamed that if I wasn't his, I wouldn't be anyone's. He slammed my head against the ground, and I felt my skull bounce against the concrete over and over. Everything became blurry, the pain was unbearable, and the only thing I could think was that I didn't want to die there, that I didn't want my life to end that way. At some point, I lost track of how long I had been beaten. The only thing I remember is that I felt everything fade away. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move, and in my mind there was only darkness. But then I heard voices. Someone shouted my name, and he, scared, got up and ran away. They left me there, alone, broken. I don't know how much time passed before someone came over and called an ambulance, but all I remember is that, in that moment, I felt completely helpless. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My face was swollen, several ribs were broken, and I had bruises all over my body. I couldn't recognize myself in the mirror, and every time I closed my eyes, I relived those moments. The doctor said I had been lucky, that I had arrived just in time. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken, terrified, and worst of all, I knew this wasn't over. A few days after being in the hospital, I received news that left me in shock. My ex had attacked my new boyfriend. He waited for him outside the gym, ambushed him, and beat him with a brutality that nearly killed him. When they told me, I felt everything crumble. He hadn't just attacked me. Now he was also attacking the person I cared about most. They left him in intensive care, with multiple fractures to his face, ribs, and almost all his teeth broken. I spent entire nights unable to sleep, sitting by his bed in the hospital, unable to do anything but hold his hand and pray for this to end once and for all. Every breath he took was a victory, but at the same time, every breath reminded me that this didn't have an easy ending. My ex was still free, and although the authorities promised to do something, everything felt like a waiting game that was consuming me. My boyfriend survived, but the aftermath was profound, both physically and emotionally. I couldn't understand how someone could have so much pent-up hatred. He spent weeks in the hospital, and every time I saw him, with bandages covering his face and his gaze lost, I couldn't help but feel like it was all my fault. But he never blamed me. He always told me we'd get through it, that this would only make us stronger. Eventually, my ex was arrested after continuing to harass me even from a distance. It was a relief to know he couldn't hurt us anymore. But the fear and distrust still linger. Every time I see someone who looks like him, my body freezes, and the fear takes hold of me again. No matter how many doors I put between us or how many times I tell myself it's over, that sense of danger never completely goes away. I've learned to live with it, but I can't help but look back and think about everything that happened, about how things could have turned out much worse if I hadn't received help at those critical moments. After he was arrested, we were finally able to breathe a little easier, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remain. My boyfriend left the hospital after months of recovery, but not without carrying the consequences. Rehabilitation was tough, not just for him, but for both of us. I accompanied him to every physical therapy session, watching him struggle each day to regain something as simple as a smile. And the worst part was that, while he was willing to move on, I felt trapped in the past, reliving every punch, every insult, every hateful look from my ex. At first, we couldn't leave the house without feeling watched. We moved to a different neighborhood further away and reinforced the security of our home. We installed cameras, changed the locks, and avoided places where we knew he could have found out we would be. Paranoia became a constant companion, and although we tried to move on with our lives, the shadow of what had happened remained, always present. One afternoon, shortly after we moved, we decided to go for a walk to clear our heads. We went to a quiet park we had discovered almost by accident, where we rarely saw people. We walked hand in hand, trying to enjoy a moment of calm, but the fear was always there. I remember that at one point my boyfriend stopped and looked me in the eyes with a seriousness I had never seen before. He told me that no matter what happened, he would be there, that I didn't have to keep feeling alone or scared. His words comforted me, but they also made me cry. I realized how much all of this had taken from us. Peace, joy, the certainty of feeling normal. With time, we started to rebuild ourselves. We supported each other every step of the way, celebrated every little victory as if it were a big achievement, because for us, it was. It wasn't easy, but we managed to move forward. There were moments when I thought about giving up, when I thought I'd never be able to get over what had happened. But his presence, his strength, and his love reminded me that there was still something worth fighting for. Now, years later, I can say I've learned to live with my past. I still have nightmares, and there are days when the fear comes back without warning. But I also have someone by my side who shows me that, despite everything, there is light after the darkness. My ex, thankfully, is still serving his sentence. And although I know he'll be released one day, I also know I'm no longer the vulnerable girl who once let herself be intimidated. Every scar, every painful memory, is a reminder of what I survived. And although I would have preferred not to go through any of this, I also know it made me stronger. I'm here to tell my story, not as a victim, but as someone who found the strength to keep going. My ex tried to destroy me, but he failed. And although I'll never fully regain the peace he took from me, today I can say I'm in a better place. Thanks to my boyfriend, the friends who didn't leave me alone, and everyone who helped me during those dark times, I found a path to healing. This is my story, and although it's not easy to tell, I know it's important to share. Because there are many people living in silence, trapped in relationships that become toxic and dangerous, and they need to realize there is a way out, that there is hope beyond the fear. Today I'm still with this guy, the one who supported me through the worst moments, and I firmly believe he's the love of my life. It's taken us a lot to get here, but every day together is a small victory. And if there's one thing I can say after all this, it's that you should never let anyone make you feel like less than what you are. Because no one deserves to live in fear, and we all deserve a life where we can feel safe. When I was in high school, I was a goth drama girl. Most of my friends were other goths, geeks, juggalos, juggalettes, etc. I don't want to reinforce an unhealthy stereotype, but I was really one of the only students in my friend group who took school somewhat seriously and kept my grades as high as possible. I wanted to go to college. I also had a part-time job that I really enjoyed and was a dedicated employee. All of this will be important later in the story. I started dating a guy from the group, let's call him Joshua, and it was the summer before my senior year. He was a year and a half younger than me. Technically, he was a junior, but he had failed so many classes that his credits only added up to those of a freshman. He was also very vocal about wanting to drop out of school because he thought it was useless. Joshua was very affectionate and attentive to me, but he became suffocating. He was always trying to kiss and hug me in public, but public displays of affection made me very uncomfortable. When I asked him to stop, he felt very hurt. I just wanted him to respect a boundary. Plus, I wanted him to break that habit before school started because there was a no PDA, public displays of affection policy, and I wasn't going to get written up in my senior year for something I didn't want to do. Anyway, early in the year, I found out that I had the option to graduate early in December of that year. So I wouldn't be returning after Christmas break. I was so excited and proud of myself. I told all my friends, including Joshua, at lunch that day. Most were happy for me, but that announcement devastated Joshua. He begged me to stay in school and take 4 electives so that he could see me every day. I declined his proposal. I wanted to sleep in and take a break before starting college. He cried a lot, and our friends had mixed reactions to this flood of emotion. Most of the girls thought it was so sweet. The guys ignored it or kept telling him to chill out. He got down on one knee and declared that he was hopelessly in love with me and wanted to marry me. He said he couldn't bear going to school every day without me there. I was 17, almost 18, and my young mind and heart actually thought that was kind of romantic. But I still told him he had to stay in school to have a chance at getting a decent job. You can't even join the Army without a high school diploma or a GED, General Educational Development Certificate. Also, you can't just drop out at 16 in our state. Even though he hated school and basically slept through all his classes, he was incredibly intelligent, as well as cunning, and a computer and internet genius. Right before winter break, he had come up with a plan to bypass the dropout clause. First, his mom worked from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening every day and was gone before the buses arrived to pick him and his younger siblings up. She would never know he didn't leave for school. Second, he lived in housing where the electricity bill was part of the rent, so his family didn't have a separate electricity bill. His mom had put her sister's electricity in her name for some reason, and she lived in a completely different school district. He asked to visit her house so he could see his cousin and stole the most recent bill from her pile of mail. Then he wrote a very convincing letter stating that his family was moving out of the district. Third, on the last day of school, he went to the school office, turned in the letter, handed in the bill as proof of the new address, his textbooks, and even had them print out his week transcript to really seal the deal. And they believed it completely. He never enrolled anywhere else. He knew they wouldn't call the school in that district because it was the last day before break, and everyone in our school office just wanted to leave and go home. By the time school started back up in January, They would have completely forgotten about him. He was sure he would just fall through the cracks, and truancy wouldn't come looking for him because, well, the schools in our city were underfunded, understaffed, and overworked. As I said, he was very, very smart. For the 2 months following Christmas, all he did was sleep, mess around on his computer, snack, and constantly call and text my cell phone. If I wasn't with him, he would call my work and have his cousin or a neighbor drive him to my job just to stand around and try to talk to me. My boss basically had to ban him so I could work uninterrupted. He would beg me to call in or leave early a lot so we could spend time together. In his words, he just said he missed me and was so bored all the time. As you can imagine, I was getting really sick of all this. I wanted him to do something to live up to his potential, but also to have something to take up his time so he wouldn't focus on me and only me. I told him to re-enroll in school and he flatly refused. I put my foot down and said, "Look, I can't be your only reason to exist. I'm going to college in August and I'm not going to deal with you begging and crying for me to skip class or whatever just to stay in your room playing video games or lounging around. Go back to school or get a damn job, and if you won't do the bare minimum, I'm out." After some pouting, he agreed to get a job. He didn't look very hard for a job over the course of a month, so I got him a job at a grocery store where my mom worked. We talked to the manager, and he agreed to give him a part-time job as a cashier stock boy. He moaned and groaned about having to wear a uniform shirt and a name badge. I was becoming very aware of how lazy and spoiled he really was, but I stayed with him hoping he'd grow up a little. In his second week, he got his first paycheck. He bought me flowers, gifts, took me to dinner, and just totally love-bombed me. In his third week, my mom called me from work to tell me that Joshua was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but he hadn't shown up or called in, so I called his house over and over, but no answer. Landlines were still a primary form of communication at this time. Also, it was one of my rare Saturdays off, so I had time to drive over there. I opened the front door, and the house was quiet, except for a muffled rhythmic sound coming from his bedroom in the basement. I went down there and found him deeply asleep with his blaring alarm clock buried under a pile of dirty laundry and a blanket. I said his name and kicked his mattress 3 times, but he didn't stir. He slept like the dead. I had to physically shake him like in a soap opera to wake him up. When I told him he was an hour late for work, all he said was, "Yeah, well, tell them I'm sick or something. I was up until 6 a.m., I'm tired." I was very pissed and told him to call his boss himself. He did, and he was informed that he would be written up for a no-call, no-show. He then asked me to stay and crawl into bed with him. I refused and walked out without another word. About 3 days later, he called me from work and asked for a ride home. I was off in 30 minutes, so I said okay. He came out without his apron or shirt. I asked about it, and he said he had ripped them doing something in the stockroom and would get another apron on his next shift. The next day, my mom called me from work again and asked if Joshua had told me what happened the night before. I thought she was talking about his uniform, but no, he had been fired. He had been pushing the carts really fast in the parking lot, making them jump the curb and fly through the air. He rendered 2 of them unusable by doing this. But worse than that, he had alcohol in his water bottle. He was underage, drinking hard lemonade while ringing up groceries. A customer had smelled it on his breath and reported it to the manager on duty, and he was fired immediately. That was it. I was done. Not only did he fail to keep an easy job for more than a month, but he was drinking, damaging property, and lying to me about it. I had a double shift that day and was not in the best mental state for the full 10 hours. The next day I only had 1 class in the morning. I drove to his house after class to get the stuff from his room that was mine and to tell him it was over. I found him asleep at noon and started putting my stuff in a tote bag, CDs, a few video games, some clothes, etc. I wasn't being quiet, but he was still snoring away. So I said screw it and was about to leave just as he woke up and saw me. He bounced out of bed, all happy that I was there. I told him it was over. I told him I deserved better than someone who refuses to try to get a high school diploma or keep a job longer than a month before being fired for drinking and breaking carts. He claimed they were lying, that he hadn't done any of that. I told him to stop BSing me, and that after all this, he at least owed me honesty. He eventually broke down crying, screaming, and begging me not to leave him. He promised to do better. He said he'd do anything I asked as long as I stayed his girlfriend. Come on, please don't do this. I'll die without you, please. I kept saying no and trying to walk up the stairs. He grabbed the tote bag full of my stuff and yanked it hard, causing me to lose my balance. I fell down 4 concrete steps and landed on the rough carpet they had down there. I cut my lip, my forehead, and my wrist started swelling almost immediately. I was in a daze. I couldn't feel the pain. All I felt was anger, shock, and fear. He kept apologizing over and over. When he ran to the bathroom to get a washcloth for my cuts, I stood up on shaky legs. As soon as I heard him ascend the living room stairs to the bathroom, I threw everything that had fallen out of the bag back in and started making my way up the stairs while dialing 911 on my cell. I wasn't taking any chances now. Before I pressed send, I heard his mom say, "Joshua, what the hell are you doing home so early?" His mom had apparently taken the day off to go to a doctor's appointment and run some errands. She hadn't noticed that for almost 4 months he hadn't been going to school. Apparently his siblings hadn't ratted him out, which surprised me. He was stuttering something about feeling sick that morning when I came up the stairs, bloody and holding my swollen wrist. She totally freaked out, thinking he had beaten me up or something. She started screaming at him, asking him what the hell he had done to me. He broke down crying again, saying it was an accident. He handed me the wet cloth and kept trying to hug me. His mom was demanding an explanation of why he wasn't in class and what had happened to me. He could barely talk because he was crying so hard and loud with snot and drool running down his face like a damn toddler. He curled up at my feet, hugging my legs as his mom examined my wrist. I told her everything, how he had illegally dropped out of school, gotten a job and been fired for drinking and vandalizing store property. I said I guessed what happened on the stairs was technically an accident, but it was totally avoidable. She looked down at him with such disappointment and rage. I told her I was sorry, but that I just couldn't be with her son anymore because he was an anchor around my neck and clearly unstable. I looked down at him, still crying like a baby, and told her that he needed some serious help. She agreed, completely understanding my decision. Every time I said I was going to leave, he tightened his grip. We literally had to pry him off of me, and he left finger indentations on my calves and ankles. I had to work in the back of the house at my job for 2 weeks while my face healed. Far too many customers thought I was in an abusive household and were telling managers about their concerns. My school professors also wanted to know what the hell had happened. It was embarrassing. Joshua just wouldn't leave me alone. He kept showing up at my job even though he was banned. He'd come to my house and was constantly begging me for another chance. I changed my cell phone number 4 times in 4 months, but it was fruitless. He always found it, doing his computer stuff. I tried to file a harassment complaint with the local police department, but they did next to nothing about it. They basically just told me that since he was a minor and hadn't done anything violent or illegal, I needed to just ignore him. I really regret not calling the cops the day he pulled me down the stairs. Fast forward to August, and I was going to college. I still lived at home, but it was a 30-minute drive to and from every day in heavy traffic. At least once a week, there were love notes, flowers, and mixtapes left on my car's windshield or in my mailbox. I would just toss them in the outdoor trash can or the dumpster at my job. If he happened to still be in the area, I wanted him to actually see me throw his crap away without reading it. It may sound cold, but I was just over this crap. I began dating someone named Pedro in October. He lived closer to the college, and on nights I didn't work, I would just stay over at his place. About a month after dating him, things took a very dark turn. When I would talk to Pedro on the landline, I started hearing weird clicking sounds. At first I thought it was just my call waiting malfunctioning or the phone itself. Sometimes my call would get disconnected completely. Pedro began getting phone calls in the middle of the night. The same number would show up on his caller ID every time. When he picked up, there would be dead air. It happened over and over again until he just unplugged the phone from the wall. The same number started calling my home and cell phone constantly, with dead air. I had to turn my cell phone off at night while at work. My mom would just turn all the home phones to silent at night and told my dad if he needed to get a hold of us, to call the nocturnal neighbor. It was so aggravating. I knew it was Joshua. He was screwing with me through his computer or something, but I had no way to prove it. I woke up one night around 2 a.m. to the motion detection lights seeping through my curtains. Then there was a tapping on my window. My stomach was in knots. I barely peeked out my window and saw the undeniable lanky silhouette of my ex. I heard him breathing really hard and muttering what sounded like, "I know you're home, your car is here. Open the window." I started backing out of my room slowly and quietly. Now, my dad usually worked the graveyard shift, but on this night, he was actually home and watching TV in the living room. I told him that Joshua was outside tapping on my window, and he got very mad about this. He told me to stay on the couch as he called the police. The taps then became loud knocks that could be heard from other rooms. It woke up my sister and my mother. The loud knocks then became bangs. It was like he was punching the damn glass. I was afraid he would end up breaking my window, so I went back in and pulled up my mini blinds. There he stood, tears and snot running down his red face. I cracked the window just a tad so I could speak to him through the screen. I then said in a loud whisper, "What the hell is wrong with you, Joshua?" "It's 2 in the morning. I have class in 6 hours. This isn't romantic, it's gross, it's lunatic behavior. You're actually insane, Joshua. Why can't you just fuck off and go away?" His eyes and demeanor totally shifted. He took a deep, shaky breath and muttered, "Does he worship you the same way that I do? If you broke up with him tomorrow, would he be destroyed like I am? Would he do everything in his power to win you back like I am? Would he even care?" "I promise you he wouldn't. He's nothing. I am yours and you are mine. You need to wake up and see that. And you also need to see that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going away." He stepped back a bit and rattled off Pedro's full name, address, license plate letter, and number combination, and a few other things I didn't even know. I didn't even know what to say to that. He then smiled in a way that would make Stanley Kubrick himself shudder and walked to his mom's car, which, keep in mind, he didn't have a license to drive, then took off. The cops showed up a full 15 minutes after he had left. They took mine and my father's statements, and I told them about the clicking sounds and the number that kept calling me and my boyfriend. The cop said he'd start a file, but again, there wasn't really anything he could do without proof of violence or whatever. I told Pedro what happened the next day in class, and it really freaked him out. Everything Joshua found was public record, so it wasn't even illegal, but it clearly was a threat. I told him if he wanted to break up, I understood. We hadn't been together that long, and I knew all this was way too much for a fresh relationship. He said no, but that he was going to get some security equipment for his house, and that he was always going to park under a CCTV camera at school from now on. The calls and clicks kept happening. Every time I heard a click, I just hung up with whomever I was speaking to. About 2 weeks after the incident at my house, the cop that had come out that night called my house to speak with me. I don't know if he was a detective or whatever, but he was telling me a few things about the case he wanted to build against Joshua. As we were speaking, the phone made that clicking sound again. "Did you hear that?" I said. "Yes," he said, and as he was saying something about meeting at my house, our call was disconnected. He called back immediately, and as soon as he said who he was, the clicking started again. The cop blurted out and then hung up before the call could be cut again. When he showed up, he asked me questions about Joshua, how old he was, how he wasn't enrolled in school, his parents, his computer skills, the phone issues, etc. He said the number that kept calling us was the main number for our local phone company. It was the number you call when you pay your bill over the phone or when you need a line or jack repair, things like that. He didn't know how, but he knew that Joshua was tapping our lines and causing the calls to disconnect at his will. He gave me his card with his personal cell phone number and said to call him if Joshua ever approached me again anywhere. I felt a bit safer knowing I was finally being taken seriously now. About 3 weeks later, I decided to quit my job because the hours and the distance from school were just really stressful. I wanted to spend the night at Pedro's more often since it was closer to school. I felt a lot better knowing that Joshua wouldn't really bother my family if he knew I wasn't there. Plus, if I was with Pedro, he couldn't tap our conversations over the phone. Pedro had put in some cameras and motion sensor lights, so I felt safe. I got a part-time job in the college bookstore and cafe. About a week into working there, my old boss called me to ask if I was okay. I asked why, and he said Joshua had come to my old job and demanded to see me. When he was told that I had quit, he demanded to know if I was working anywhere else. I hadn't told anyone there that I had gotten a job inside the college, so they told him they didn't know and wouldn't tell him even if they did because they knew he was very obsessive and threatening. He blew a gasket. He tore the reservation line phone off the wall, pushed over the host stand, and hurled a load of obscenities while customers looked on in terror. And he had taken off before the cops arrived, of course, but they did have CCTV footage of this act and had given it to the cops. So now they had proof of violence. After talking to the cop about all that went down at my former job, he said he was going to talk to Joshua's mother at her job. I also gave him Pedro's number so he could tell the cop what he had experienced too. He said he'd keep me updated. Everything went radio silent for a few days. No calls, no clicks, no notes, nothing. It was the most peace I had experienced in months. But of course it was short-lived. We were throwing my grandmother a surprise birthday party that Saturday. Pedro drove me there to meet my granny, and we had a great time. Afterwards, I was really tired and didn't feel like going to Pedro's to spend the night. He kissed me goodbye and went home, and I rode home with my parents. I was asleep in my bed for a few hours when I heard a tapping on my window. I had hoped it was just a dream, but there it was again. 7 fast taps that were louder than the first. I picked up my cell phone and called the cop. He picked up almost immediately, and I then whispered, "Joshua is outside my window again." He told me to stay on the phone with him while he called dispatch on his radio. The taps became bangs again, and I was so exhausted and pissed that I put the phone on the edge of my bed near the window, pulled up my blinds, and raised the glass partially. He just stared at me, shivering in the autumn cold. "Cops have been called to my house. They've been to my mom's job. Your old boss said he wouldn't press charges if I started going to therapy or something. My mom has to re-enroll me in school so she doesn't get in trouble," he said to me. I glared at him. "Well, I'm not doing any of that. I can't be something I'm not, and I can't live without you. You're all I think about. You're the only reason I get out of bed." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a ring box. He opened it and asked me to run away with him and to be his forever. I let out a kind of snort laugh. I didn't mean to, I swear it was involuntary, but it was authentically how I felt. His eyes went dark again. He reached into his inner coat pocket with his free hand and brought out a very large kitchen knife. The bright security lights bounced off the blade. Now I was truly scared. I completely forgot that my cell phone was still connected to the cop, and I picked up my landline to call 911. It was dead. "Yeah, so the wires are cut, and don't even try to get your cell phone. If you leave my side, I'll shove this thing into my jugular. No ambulance will reach me in time," he said to me. I was in absolute shock. "You have 2 choices. You can get dressed, pack a bag, and come with me with this ring on your hand. Or you can stand there, do nothing, and have my blood on your hands. I've already left a note for my mother. It says if I end up dead, it's because you let me die." Everything was in slow motion now. I vaguely heard the cop calling my name through my cell phone. I snapped back to reality and said loudly, "Put the knife down, Joshua, you need help." I hoped the cop had heard me. The cops that were coming needed to know that he was armed. "I need you, only you." "So what's it gonna be? My wife or my murderer? A ring or blood?" He then put the tip of the knife to his throat and stepped closer to my window. The air was static now. I can't tell you how much time passed from his last sentence to when the red and blue lights finally blinded me. I only heard the officer then say, "Drop it, get on the ground." I couldn't see him. I looked at Joshua, his eyes still locked on me, but now he looked terrified, with tears rolling down his cheek. I expected any second for him to shove that knife as deep as he could before the officer got to him. But he didn't. He fell to his knees, dropped both the knife and the ring box in the grass, and let out a loud wail of defeat. Within seconds, he was in handcuffs. I put on my robe and went outside. The cop who had taken me seriously was at the bottom of the porch, and he gave me a hug. He told me that he tried to call his mother, but the calls weren't going through. My mom woke up from the lights and yelling and came running outside in her nightgown. Our neighbors, including the nocturnal one, were coming out of their houses to watch all the drama. I heard them say they were taking Joshua to the hospital first. He was kicking the windows of the cruiser, screaming and crying. I pressed charges, and he ended up at a mental hospital that was attached to a juvenile detention center for quite a while. I don't know what happened to him after he turned 18. His mother called shortly after all this happened, and she apologized for everything he did. But I assured her that it wasn't her fault. She allowed the police to search everything of his cell phone, his computer, his room, etc. He had apparently stolen equipment from a phone company truck that was left unsupervised, and that's how he was able to tap disconnect calls. Oh, and the ring? Yeah, that was also stolen. Pedro and I broke up soon after, but it was amicable. I just couldn't be in a relationship after all that. I started therapy. Now here I am in my 30s. I haven't really thought about all of this for years, but I decided to type it all out and send it to you because I was checking my other folder on Facebook yesterday, and there was a DM from his name. I want to give a big thank you to this channel for telling my story. Please, stay safe, everyone. My name is Abigail and I recently turned 30. I live on the outskirts of a town that you could say is known for having very bad water, if that helps give you a hint. The story I'm about to tell is pretty terrifying and sadly very real. I met my now ex 7 years ago. Let's call him William for privacy reasons. We had actually first talked on a dating website and, ironically, ran into each other at a local bar months later. He came up to me and said, "Hey, you look familiar, didn't we talk online before?" Those words led to us talking all night long, and then we met up again later that week when he invited me over for dinner at his house. He seemed pretty normal. He lived alone and had a good job as an electrician. He was also quite attractive, although he was 10 years older than me, which didn't bother me because I had always dated people older than me. There was always a kind of sadness in his eyes, which not long after we started seeing each other I found out was due to his kids living in another state with their grandmother. His ex-wife had died from unknown causes while they were in the process of getting divorced, but that will come into play later in the story. The fact that he didn't have custody was definitely a red flag since I had a 3-year-old daughter, but the reasons he explained to me made sense at the time. After being together for a while, his jealousy started to show. He would accuse me of cheating on him whenever I didn't answer the phone right away or if I wanted to do anything with friends or family. One night he started a fight when I had to be up for work really early, yelling at me to wake up. I told him to leave me alone at least 10 times until I couldn't take it anymore and threw a pillow at him. He immediately threatened to call the police, and I'd had enough. So, I locked myself in the room with my daughter so I could get some sleep. He then took the door handle off and said I'd better talk to him or he'd call the police. I'd honestly had enough at this point because now he was doing this in front of my daughter. I called my mom to come get us because I knew that if she showed up, he would let me leave. My mom finally arrived, and as soon as my daughter stepped onto the porch, he grabbed my arm as I was walking out, pulled me back inside, then shut the door, leaving my mom and daughter outside. He was pleading with me not to go, and after a while, with my mom banging on the door and threatening to call the police, he finally let me go. After returning to my mom's house, I knew I was done with that relationship. The very next day, I got my dad, aunt, brother, and some cousins to help me get my things out and put them in a storage unit. Even in front of my dad, who was very scary and intimidating, William kept trying to plead with me not to leave, until my dad finally said, "You don't speak to her. You don't even look at her." After leaving him, he texted me every single day, begging me to talk to him. Some of the texts were very nice, like, "No matter what happens, I'll always love you, Abigail." Then it would be, "You're such a bitch, you're probably with some guy right now." Then another text would come through about how amazing I was in bed and how no one in the world could make him feel the way I did. Finally, he would threaten that if I didn't talk to him, he would post all the pictures I had sent him online for everyone to see. Fast forward a few days later, and he sent my family members all sorts of lies about me, telling them I was a drug addict and doing all sorts of crazy things. That's when I finally had enough and called the police to report harassment. The officer who showed up was actually my mom's friend's ex-husband, so I knew him personally. He called my ex on the phone, and the conversation went as follows. "Hey, is this William?" "Yeah, who the fuck is this?" "This is an officer, and you really need to leave Abigail the fuck alone. This is a prank call. You're not a real officer. Suck my dick, idiot." And then he hung up. The officer told me to get in his patrol car and show him where William lived, which was just down the road. When we pulled up, William was getting into his car to leave. On the way there, the officer noticed William had a warrant for unpaid tickets. He immediately stepped out of the car and arrested him right there on the hood of his car. I got into the front seat of the patrol car, and the whole way back to my house, William was saying, "Abigail, I still love you, baby. I love you so much. Why are you doing this?" Before the officer could tell him to shut up. When I finally got dropped back off at my house, the officer got out of the car and told me to stay away from him, that he was the kind of man who would kill me one day, and that he had a prior restraining order against him from another woman. That definitely freaked me out. But the second he got out of jail, he immediately started texting me again, telling me he forgave me and how much he loved me more than anything. Fast forward a couple of years. During this time, I got married, and throughout those years, William would still find me on any platform and send random messages letting me know he still loved me and always would. Well, eventually my ex-husband and I went through a divorce, and let's just say I went wild and completely out of control. So I actually entertained my ex like a complete idiot. and I went on some dates with him and stayed over at his house regularly. I was feeling really insecure after my divorce, but my mindset was pretty ignorant, and my family was extremely angry with me. Everything went pretty well at first, but then once again it didn't. He started doing crazy things like accusing me of sleeping with my own family members and lying to my friends to get them mad at me, telling them that I secretly hated them and saying all sorts of ridiculous things. He even sent flowers to my work, my mom's house, my sister's house, my aunt's house, and my house again all in one day. Thousands of dollars worth of flowers just to get me to talk to him after I told him I couldn't take it anymore. I agreed to go to his house and talk, which was the biggest mistake of my life. When I got there, he was sitting on his bed and I sat down next to him. He was being really sweet at first, thanking me for coming over. But then his facial expressions turned sinister. He told me that he knew I'd slept with someone else, and I assured him I hadn't, that I wasn't interested in anyone at that time. Then he stood up and started screaming at me. "Yes, you did. I know you slept with someone and you'd better admit it right now." I kept telling him I didn't, and that I wasn't going to admit to something I hadn't done. Then he said, "You'd better admit it right fucking now or I'll squeeze the fucking life out of you." I hesitated but finally screamed, "Okay, fine, I guess I did." Then he jumped on top of me, squeezing my face and shaking my head. "You're a fucking bitch, how could you do this to me? You're just like Laura, my fucking ex-wife." It turns out Laura was his ex-wife who had died from unknown causes. Her death was ruled inconclusive. I started punching him in the head and he eventually jolted up off the bed and stood by the doorway. I tried to escape, but he told me I wasn't going anywhere. I ran to the sliding glass door on the other side of the bed and started banging and screaming for help. I was in a panic, just begging for someone to hear me. William looked me in the eyes and in the creepiest voice said, "Here, let me help you." And he started banging on the sliding glass door, screaming for help and laughing. I then jumped onto the bed and crawled under the covers, putting a pillow over my head. Don't ask me why, but in that moment I felt it was the only way to hide, to somehow get away from his evil eyes staring at me. He kept talking to me, but I wouldn't answer him. "Abigail, Abigail, Abigail." It was like I was in some kind of horror movie. I eventually peeked out from under the pillow and tried to jump up and leave, but he pinned me down on the bedroom floor. I eventually just gave in and told him what he wanted to hear. I told him he was right, that I hated myself for hurting him, and that I was never going to do anything without him again. But that he had to let me call my friend Jessica to tell her I was okay, or she would call my mom, and she would come over. He let me keep some distance between us so I could make the call, so I took the opportunity to call 911. I screamed for help, saying I was being held captive by this guy I was dating, and shouted the address. William immediately ran out of the house, jumped in his car, and took off. I ran to a neighbor's yard and waited for the cops to arrive. The police arrived quickly and immediately issued a warrant for his arrest. I was shaken and terrified, but at least for the moment I was safe. Weeks went by and William eventually got out of jail. By that time I had already started talking to someone new and I was completely done with William's madness. I testified against him in court, but he only received fines and was sentenced to take anger management classes. A few weeks after that, I was driving down the road when I heard a strange hissing noise. At first I thought my tire was going flat from the sound, but then I felt something touch my arm, which was resting on the middle console. I turned around and saw a possum. Yes, you heard that right. This sick man had trapped a possum and put it in my car. He knew how terrified I was of rodents. I had mentioned it many times in the past. I quickly pulled into the parking lot of a nearby restaurant, jumped out of the car, and opened all the doors. I stayed as far away from the car as I could, talking on the phone with the guy I was seeing at the time. He couldn't come to help me because he was with his son. After waiting a while, I gathered the courage to check the car again. Luckily, I didn't see the possum anymore. I didn't call the police because honestly, what proof did I have? And how crazy would I have sounded telling them that story? But deep down, I knew it was William. A few weeks later, my mom sent me a screenshot of a picture of William. Sitting next to him was a girl who looked exactly like me. And when I say exactly, I mean identical blonde hair, blue eyes, round face, curvy body, everything. My dad was convinced it had to be a Photoshop job. But no, the girl was real. Not only was William stalking me, but he was using some poor girl just because she looked like me. About a month later, I was at work when I noticed that one of my tires was completely flat. A large screw was lodged deep into it. At first, I didn't connect it to William. I thought I had just run over it accidentally. My stepdad patched it up and I went home. The next morning, my boyfriend at the time and I found hundreds of screws scattered all over my driveway, and now 2 more tires were flat. That was when I knew for sure it was William. Determined to catch him, I downloaded a phone call recording app and decided to get him to admit to what he had done. I called him from a private number as he didn't have my new one. He picked up and I asked if he wanted to come over. He sounded surprised and asked, "Really? You actually want to see me?" I told him yes, that I wanted him to come over and watch a video I had of him dumping screws in my driveway. He sighed and said, "Please, Abigail, I don't want to go to jail." I immediately hung up and called the police the next day to file for an immediate restraining order. The judge granted me the order for a year. Over the years, William continued to send me messages from fake accounts, and he even sent messages to my fiancée, who is now my husband. Fortunately, I haven't heard from him in over a year now, but I did hear through the grapevine that he's dating someone with the same last name as me, which is pretty creepy. Whenever I think back on William's deceased ex-wife, I can't help but wonder what really happened to her. Did he kill her? Could that have been me? I guess I'll never know for sure. But to my psycho ex, I have no intentions of ever talking to you or seeing you again. Stay out of my life for good. In December 2018, I broke up with my ex after 7 years together. It was a painful breakup, full of ups and downs and many tears, but it was for the best. We had hurt each other more than we wanted to admit, and I knew I needed space to rediscover myself and ultimately heal from everything I had been through. After being in a relationship for so long, I had no idea what it was like to be alone, let alone re-enter the dating world. So I decided to take it slow. I wasn't ready to jump into anything right away. I wanted to regain my independence and not rely on anyone. In February, I decided to go out with some friends to a bar we used to frequent. It was one of those nights where everything seemed to align, allowing me to forget my problems, if only for a while. Amid the laughter, drinks, and good company, I ran into a guy who, although he didn't catch my attention much at first, seemed nice. I didn't think much of it at the time because honestly I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to enjoy the night and unwind. We ran into each other again a few weeks later at the same place. This time he was more persistent. He asked for my phone number, and even though something inside me told me not to, I didn't want to be rude, so I gave it to him. By the end of March, after exchanging a few messages, I felt I could trust him a bit more and invited him to a party at my house. Everything was pretty normal at first. He stayed after the party and, well, one thing led to another. It was a casual encounter, nothing serious, but afterward, I began to feel strange. I don't know how to explain it, but there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. He was too persistent, too present. The way he looked at me, the way he approached me, as if he already knew me much better than I was willing to let him, made me nervous. So I asked him to leave that very night, and in my mind, I had already decided I didn't want to talk to him again. I thought that would be the end of it, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Soon after, the strange messages started. At first they were innocent, like, "I hope you have fun fishing." The weird thing was I hadn't mentioned anything about that on social media. I hadn't posted a single picture or comment about my plans, and no one knew I was going fishing. Then he sent me a message saying, "I hope the movie was good." I froze. I had gone to the movies alone, trying to enjoy some time by myself and clear my mind, but again, I hadn't posted anything online about where I was or what I was doing. I started to feel watched, like someone was following my every move. As the days passed, the messages became more frequent and increasingly unsettling. He would ask which part of the bar I was in, describing the exact spots where I was, even though I hadn't told anyone or posted where I was going. It was as if he was right behind me, invisible but always present. Paranoia began to take over me. Every time I entered a bar, I couldn't stop looking around. My heart would race, and every time my phone vibrated, I would startle, fearing it was his name on the screen. The scariest part of all was that we didn't have any mutual friends. There was no way he could know where I was unless he was following me. The feeling of being watched, of someone always lurking, robbed me of sleep. I slept poorly, waking up startled at the slightest noise, and every time I thought I could relax, another message would arrive, reminding me that I wasn't alone, that he was there. The last straw was in April when my friends, wanting to cheer me up, decided to take me to Washington, D.C. to celebrate my 25th birthday. We had planned a night of bar-hopping, carefree fun. The idea was to distract me, make me forget all the bad experiences, and have a good time far away from everything. I was happy to be with them, and for a moment I thought everything was returning to normal. That night, we went from place to place, enjoying ourselves like I hadn't in a long time. I felt free, without the weight of that feeling of being watched. Around 2:30 in the morning, we left the last bar we were at and decided to cross the street to buy some cookies at a store. As we left with our bags, laughing, I felt like I was in a dream, a moment so simple, so ordinary, but full of joy. And then I saw him. He was there, standing right on the sidewalk, looking at me. My heart sank in my chest, and I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I couldn't believe it. In the middle of such a big city, in a place where he shouldn't have been, there he was, smiling as if everything were normal. He walked over and, with that now sinister voice, said, "I hope this and that was fun. I wanted to say hello earlier, but since you haven't been answering my messages, I didn't want to scare you." I was terrified. I couldn't get the words out, and my mind went blank. I tried to keep my composure, but fear had me paralyzed. My friends looked at me, confused, not understanding the seriousness of the moment. I couldn't stop thinking about how he had managed to follow me there, how he knew exactly where I would be and why he was doing all of this. I felt trapped, exposed, and worst of all, I had no idea how far he would go. Fortunately, my friend's husband, seeing my reaction, intervened. He stood between us and confronted him, demanding that he leave and threatening to call the police if he didn't. For a moment, I thought something much worse was going to happen, that this wouldn't end well, but the stalker backed off. He didn't say another word, just gave me one last look before turning around and disappearing into the night. I couldn't help but break down crying at that moment. The relief of seeing him go mixed with the fear of thinking about what could have happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed in bed, clinging to my friend, trembling and feeling more vulnerable than ever. The next day, I changed my phone number and started looking for a new place to live. I couldn't stay in the same spot, knowing he could find me again. I moved as quickly as I could, and since then I haven't heard from him directly. But the fear has never completely gone away. Every time I feel like someone is following me, every time I get a message from an unknown number, my heart races and the paranoia returns. After sharing my story with some friends, I realized that I couldn't go on like this. I received many comments from people telling me I should go to the police, that this wasn't something I could ignore. So I decided to do the right thing. I contacted the local police and they advised me to file a report at the precinct in the city where I used to live. Fortunately, I lived close enough to go in person and file the paperwork for a restraining order. I went in on a Tuesday, shaking with nerves, with all the evidence I had. Screenshots of the messages, photos of him at the places where he had followed me. Everything I had saved as proof of his stalking. I knew his full name and where he worked, which made it easier for the police to track him down. The sheriff assured me that with all the evidence and the testimony of my friends, there would be no problem getting a restraining order. It was a temporary 15-day order, but with everything I had presented, they were confident the judge would extend it for 2 years. Now I'm waiting for that court date. Every day is a challenge, but I feel a little safer knowing I've done something to protect myself. The idea of seeing him again still terrifies me, but I'm no longer the same scared person I was before. I'm determined not to let him control my life any longer. My story is a constant reminder of how fragile safety can be, but also of the strength I found to face my fear. I don't know what will happen in the future, but one thing is certain. I will never let anyone make me feel that vulnerable again. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night still hearing his voice in my head, but I take a deep breath and remind myself that I'm doing the right thing. Thanks to everyone who gave me advice and support, because thanks to you, I made the decision to fight for my safety.